now via Skype from Asheville, North Carolina is charting man Dan McDermitt from thechartguys.com. Dan, welcome again.
Glad to be back.
Dan, incredible week in the cannabis space. Why don't we start with the let's start with the Fed move and the effect that that had on broader markets.
So yeah, the FOMC pretty much came out and said we're not going to raise rates in 2019, which is what the market wants to hear in terms of having confidence. And we saw a significantly bullish reaction, but it's been a very wild 2 days for the markets overall, because in the initial reaction to the FOMC, it was all bull. And then at the end of the day, it dumped pretty hard. Then the next day, which was yesterday, it was all raging bull. Some of the strongest buying that I've seen in one single day for the S&P 500. And now today, it's a complete dump again. So in the past 2 days since the FOMC, we've seen straight bull, straight bear, bigger bull, bigger bear. So this overreactions in both directions, which are making it very interesting in terms of trying to get some clarity as where we're heading in the short term.
Sure. Historically, this kind of sudden upsurge in volatility, that generally either presages a psychotic break of sorts in markets, either to the upside or the downside. Do you see anything in your sort of charting that gives any sort of clarity on what direction we're going to emerge from after this volatility subsides?
Well, when I look at the monthly chart for the S&P 500, which is, as long-term as I will look, it looks like an equilibrium setup, and we'll look at it in just a moment here. But the most likely scenario for me would be a lower high compared to the all-time highs, and then a pullback to a higher low with a bit of a tightening range. So I'm looking on the shorter-term timeframes for signals. They're gonna tell me that this is the likely scenario playing out. And for me, it's a weekly support level, which I'll point out, that needs to hold. And that's the most important level for me. So as I'm looking, I'm personally looking to establish longer term US MJ positions. I'm going to be watching very close to see if the S&P 500 is going to be entering this tightening monthly pattern, because if it is, that tells me to be very patient and, scale in slowly, because we could be pulling back for the next month or two in the market. And I think next week is going to give us a whole lot of clarity, because the 2 days since the FOMC announcement have been very back and forth, touch and go.
Mm-hmm. And that's had quite an effect on the cannabis sector, particularly for the multi-state operators in the United States.
We've had very interesting scenario the past few days where the major Canadian LPs, we've got, Cron and CGC breaking key daily support levels in their patterns, losing their daily uptrends. Yet we have, some U.S. multi-state operators seeing some very significant bullish action yesterday, and some of them even holding up pretty well today. So the sector is going in different directions to a certain degree, but we are still seeing the effect of SPY overall, that it has. And right now, it's certainly giving us signs of caution in the marijuana sector overall.
Mm-hmm. Curaleaf was a particular beneficiary of the bullish sentiment yesterday. What was the cause behind that?
So Curaleaf put out this Blitz, and it was really cool to see happen, because whoever was behind that Blitz understands markets. There's so many times where, we'll see something, and an example would just be OGI recently hit, blue sky breakout, all-time highs for the first day. And then the next day, they put out news about raising funds for potential dilution incoming, which the market responded negatively to. So anybody that held overnight looking for blue sky breakout momentum, was slapped on the wrists. And we've seen now since then, OGI has a pattern at the end of the day selling off as people aren't wanting to hold it. So that is an example of a company doing, in my opinion, a poor job of managing, their news releases or timing of things. But for Curaleaf, we had news come out that BlackRock has an investment now. I think it's around $11 million. We had news about a share lockup being kicked down the road, so those shares are not going to become free trading as soon as they were anticipated. We had dispensary opening news. We had CVS, which is a big, drugstore here in the U.S. News. That was big news as well. So they just slammed the market with everything. They scheduled to get on CNBC for a talk, and it was just this PR blitz that gained a ton of attention. The stock price ran 30% to all-time highs, and it was just, a perfectly executed play by management, and perhaps BlackRock had a little helping hand in orchestrating that, but really cool to see it follow through in the way that it has.
Sure. And then today we're seeing that MedMen has done a $250 million raise from Gotham Green partners. Does that interest you at all in terms of future potential action in MedMen shares?
Well, what interests me more than that news is the reaction to news in terms of price. So I'm always watching trends, and I'm not going to be looking to establish any long-term positions in weekly downtrends. And MedMen has clearly stood out as a laggard to the sector as a whole because it's been in a weekly downtrend while everybody else has been in a weekly uptrend. So now we're shifting that momentum a little bit, and we just broke the weekly lower high pattern. So I'm definitely keeping an eye on MedMen now because of that shift in momentum. So for some people, that raise could be a fundamental catalyst for starting to have interest in MedMen. And for me, it's the price reaction and the technical aspect that has me starting to pay more attention.
Sure. And finally, I just wanted to ask your opinion about Aurora, who was formerly a client, is not a client presently, though I do have a long-term position in the company. Nelson Peltz joins the board and the stock adds $3 billion. To me, that's like, wow. Like, is that addition to the board worth $3 billion, or is that just like some persistent upside sentiment as a result of that or other things?
We were all scratching our heads. We were baffled at the size of the move by that news. But if you overlay the S&P 500 chart with ACB over the last 2 weeks, it's clear that it's had some very significant correlation with it in terms of the move that we saw to the upside. So it was almost like that news was just a little extra, rocket fuel to continue pushing higher. The breakout was already underway before that news, and it just added to it. But the S&P 500 played a large part in that move up over the last few weeks.
All right, let's go take a look at the charts.
So we're starting on the S&P 500 daily chart, and we can see that we just had a little pullback. Then there's our big, huge bull move yesterday, matched with a big, huge bear move today. So choppy action the past few days. And on the grand scheme of things, compared to the last 3 weeks where we came from, it's not a huge pullback. It's just, adding some interesting psychology to the market where people are saying, wait a second, the FOMC just gave us what the market wanted to hear. Now we're seeing the financial sector completely dumped down 3% today. And there's, uncertainty. And this is the kind of scenario where if everybody's expecting bullish and then we start to pull back, that spikes fear. What's going on? Why is this happening? But what I'm looking at is the monthly time frame. Like I said, the tightening range, I would anticipate just from experience that the normal scenario after an all-out dump and this kind of volatility is an equilibrium. We see equilibriums and tightening ranges after high volatile scenarios. So this is looking like we may be topping out for a monthly lower high to form. If that was the case, we are going to look for confirmation of that happening with a loss of the weekly uptrend. And we just established a weekly support level on SPY. That level is 272.42. So that's the most important level for me in the short term, because if we lose that support level, we lose the weekly uptrend, and then that monthly equilibrium is very likely to play out. So if that happens, we will be looking for a monthly higher low to then form. But like I said, that could lead to a couple months of pullback while we look for that higher low to form. So the next 2 weeks, in my opinion, are going to be very telling as to whether or not the monthly equilibrium is the most likely scenario, or whether the bulls can continue to hold the weekly uptrend and try and see continuation back towards that all-time high.
Wow, fascinating. Okay, and tell me about Curaleaf.
So Curaleaf obviously had the huge bull day, the close up at the high of the day with a strong close and then a big gap up open. And we're looking at this space a little bit differently in terms of gap up opens. In the Canadian MJ space, we used to have very consistent gap up open scenarios where you close at the high of the day, and a gap up is when you open over the high of the previous day. And that used to happen all the time. And it used to be, free money to a certain degree for us traders. And then the market shifted a little bit. And I do believe that pre-market trading becoming a thing as all these names uplist made it, less likely to see gap up open scenarios. But now we have these US MSOs that are not traded on, exchanges that allow for pre-market and after hours trading. So in my opinion, when we see strong closes like this, we're going to have higher odds of gap up open follow through than we would on the names that are going to be trading in pre-market. So overall, it was just perfect timing, blue sky breakout. Let's look at the weekly chart where we just saw the all-time high. We consolidated, headed right back up to it, couldn't break it, brief little pullback, and then an explosion. Again, that news blitz really doing its job and leaving its mark. And we're now looking at Curaleaf to potentially be the leader in the US MSO space because of the attention, because of the dollar volume being traded. So we're going to start watching for those correlations. Can we get lead clues on what CURA is doing back like we used to on how Canopy would dictate what the Canadian MJ sector would do?
Sure. Okay. And walk us through the scenario with MedMen, if you would.
So MedMen on the weekly time frame has been in a clear downtrend where, at this point in time, this is when everybody back in December into January just saw some real nice bounces and real nice higher lows and higher highs on the weekly. And MedMen, for a number of reasons, whether it was, some uncertainties about management and how they were spending money, or their earnings reaction was bearish. It was just a number of fundamental things that were piling up, and it led to a weak little lower high, lower low pattern. But at this point, the last weekly lower high was 447, which has broken at this point. So we're going to be watching now, can this momentum shift? Because after resistance of 506, which is the highest price that we hit from the December dump, there is a lack of resistance nearby. So if the bulls would be able to make their way up over 506 sometime in the coming month or two, there is some nice upside potential with that momentum and sentiment shift.
Okay, so does that make you a buyer today?
Not today, not with what the S&P 500 does. I would definitely put a lot of weight into the S&P 500. Today was a gap up open day. In general, a rule of thumb that we have is gap up opens are for selling, gap downs are for buying. And that just keeps us from, entering into FOMO and into hype when things are already overextended. So I will be looking for the potential of a daily higher low on MedMen to form compared to 392. And if we can see that daily higher low form, we'll have that support close by. I would establish perhaps a stop loss based off of that support, and looking for things to settle down after the big gap up open, because the gap up open momentum shifted as soon as we saw S&P 500 weakness this morning. And that has me just patient, watching what the S&P 500 is going to do and looking for MedMen to give us that daily higher low.
Right. All right, Dan, that's a solid contribution as per usual. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Have a good one, James.